And welcome everyone to our Find Your Ancestors session for today. Today we're going to be talking about coming to America by train. I'm Katie Stilp, the local history librarian here at Appleton Public Library in Appleton, Wisconsin. And we're just south of Green Bay for those who are outside of the area and wondering where in the world Appleton is. We're excited to have you this afternoon for our webinar. And first, I would just like to thank the Friends of the Appleton Public Library for providing some funding for our series for us to be able to offer it. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our Find Your Ancestors series, it happens once a month, every month, all during the year. We recently were able to expand it during the pandemic because of the large interest that we've had this year. So we're very fortunate to have the Friends of the Appleton Public Library support us. So we're able to bring some awesome speakers. Our next session is going to be December 11th, and we're going to be talking about researching ancestors who were institutionalized. So ancestors maybe who were in orphanages or mental health institutes, prisons, things like that. It will have a little bit of a focus on what records are available with the Wisconsin Historical Society, but even if you don't have Wisconsin ancestors, I definitely encourage you to attend the session or take a look at the recording because we will be discussing some tips and tricks on how to find ancestors who were institutionalized, even if they aren't in Wisconsin. Also check out the handout. Like I said, there is no handout for today's session, but in the handout that I do post, there are links to register for those upcoming programs. And I have the listing of the 2022 programs that we have booked up until April at this point. So we'll be discussing genealogy programs, breaking down your brick walls, Norwegian ancestors, and Civil War genealogy. So we have lots of exciting topics coming up next year and more to come, hopefully. If you've missed any of our other Find Your Ancestors sessions that have happened, definitely check out our YouTube channel. We do have some of the recordings available. Of course, we aren't able to record every session or keep them up there indefinitely. So just be aware that, you should try to attend live if you're able to. But if not, we do have the recordings of some of them on there. So check out the link in the handout for our YouTube channel. We are recording today's session, so if you need to go back and rewatch, or if you aren't able to stay the whole time, you can feel free to check out the recording. I'll be sending the link out on Monday. As I said, check out the handout for that link. So if you have any troubles downloading the handout, definitely reach out to me and I will send it to you via email. If you have any questions during today's session, you can use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. We have a Q&A session at the end and I'll answer questions throughout if I'm able to. I'm also enabling closed captioning for anyone who needs it. So just be aware that it is kind of a live transcript, so it's not 100% accurate. And if you do not want the closed captioning on, you can click on that button to hide the subtitles so that it's not going all over your screen. If you have any specific library questions or need help navigating our library's genealogy databases, definitely feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is in the handout, and I do offer one-on-one sessions over Zoom to help people with their genealogy. So I'm happy to help if you'd like some help. Finally, at the end of today's session, there is a short survey. It's from Project Outcome, which is an American Library Association initiative. It's just a quick 8 questions. It will pop up after you close out of Zoom. If you could just take a few minutes or seconds to fill it out and let us know what you thought of today's program, we'd appreciate it. And there's also a spot where you can let us know what future topics you'd like us to see. So as I'm continuing to plan out the 2022 topics, this is your chance to let me know what you want to see. I just want you to be aware that the survey is completely anonymous. So if you do have any questions or comments that you want me to follow up with you on, be sure to write your name or your email address or follow up with me via email so I can respond to you. Otherwise, I won't know who's asking those questions. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today. Today we have Bob Lettenberger. He is the Director of Education for the National Railroad Museum. And Bob has been a part of the museum since 1999 when he began as the Operations Manager and Communications Director. He has a passion for railroads and their history, which has led him to represent the museum in national settings such as the History Channel's Modern Marvels, Travel Channel's Mysteries of the Museum, and C-SPAN's American History TV. In his time with the museum, he has also served as a consultant to other historical organizations on railroad-related topics and reviewed numerous children's books dealing with trains. Bob completed his undergraduate studies in journalism and broadcasting at UW Oshkosh. So everybody, welcome Bob.
Thank you, Katie. I am, first off, I am totally impressed by the audience that I am speaking to today. I've done some large crowds before, but boy, this has a great international flavor to it, and I think we hopefully will have a very good learning experience this afternoon. I'm going to share my screen with you, and let's just kind of dive right into things and see what we can learn about the railroads and their role in immigration, and then how you can do some further research along the way. And I'm going to kind of roll through things here, and then, as Katie mentioned at the end, we'll do quite an extensive Q&A. So what I'd like to start off with as we talk today, we'll do some things, we'll have some discussion that is Wisconsin specific, but then I'm going to expand our discussion really to kind of a global standing as far as railroads and immigrations are concerned. And, when we think about genealogy, immigration here in Wisconsin, or really for that matter, anywhere across the United States, there's a number of interesting concepts that come up that kind of have a common thread. One of those is we see farmers being enticed into new lands with cheap, fertile farmland that they can purchase literally for next to nothing. And then in many cases, after they're there, they lose everything. Folks, we see that certain nationalities move into places that we think somewhat unusual, if you will. Take, for example, Kansas. Today we think of Kansas as wheat production. In the past, we think of Kansas as a place where longhorn cattle were driven through to the railhead coming up from Texas on their way to, bigger markets, Chicago, the East Coast, the West Coast even. But I kind of hate to tell you that, wheat is there, but the cattle are gone. And guess what? They've been replaced by Germans. And then, Chicago, that toddling town just to the south of us here in Wisconsin, it started out as purely a Native American, an Indian village. Well, no, not really. It was actually a swamp before that. And it was settled into the town that we know by Europeans. But one of the biggest characteristics of Chicago along the way, or one of the things that it's really known for, those Chicago, the blues, well, we have to bring in another nationality that brought that jazz and blues into Chicago. Folks, even today, there are folks that will travel over 1,400 miles from Central America to the south coast of the U.S. for a chance at coming into the United States. And all of these items that I've mentioned here so far, they have got one thing in common. There is something that ties all of these together. And yes, it is the railroads. Just like with so many other subjects that the railroads have touched, our chat today is going to focus on the role that they have played in immigration. How did the railroads help our ancestors get to where they are in a lot of cases? How did they move them and entice them to move from where they originally were to the new world or to new land? What did the railroads really do to make our ancestors think that this was such a really good idea? Let's start in Wisconsin with the farmers and that land. And this is the same story that, as I mentioned, is true in many places. You're looking at a map, a railroad map of the Chicago, St. Paul, and Fond du Lac Railroad from 1855 here in Wisconsin. And if you are familiar with our state, and let me see if I can get my pen tool to work with us here today. You'll notice that the railroads in the southern part of the state very well developed. Of course, Chicago here, as I mentioned, 1855, it had grown into quite the city by that point. Some of you may be familiar with Milwaukee in the southeast corner of the state, Janesville in the south central, and you notice all of this being tied together by railroads. One of the big things in this area of our state here in Wisconsin was, of course, farming. And the railroads and the farmers had an incredible relationship early on. But in the realm of railroad development, here's where we get into a little bit of a sticky wicket, if you will. The Wisconsin Constitution prohibited local governments from investing in private entities. So as railroads began to build across Wisconsin, and this happened in other states as well, the railroads approached farmers and basically had the proposition, look, you know what, with the railroad, you can grow your farm larger, which will mean that you'll make more money. You're going to grow more crops or produce more product than what you yourself can use. And so you're going to want to sell and ship that product to a larger market. Guess what? We as the railroads, we're going to help you out. But tell you what, in order for us to help you, we have to build into your territory. And to do that, we're going to need some money. So, Mr. Farmer, why don't you do this? Take out a mortgage on your land and assign that mortgage to us. Obviously, it's going to have value. We will have money then to build the railroad to serve you so that you can get bigger and we both grow and prosper. Well, in the 1850s here in Wisconsin, most of the railroads went bankrupt. And of course, those mortgages were foreclosed upon. And that meant that farmers literally lost everything. Their good farmland, their business, everything gone because of railroad mismanagement. And what was interesting about this is that it could have been a great economic disaster for Wisconsin. It was bad enough that as an agrarian state, we had farmers in peril, and now one of the biggest up and coming industries, the railroads, had failed, but the impact of the railroads failing on the farmers could really have crippled Wisconsin. Well, a number of years of bumper crops really helped the farmers get back on their feet. Plus, one other thing, even though those family farms were foreclosed on, it came down to the local sheriff's office, local authorities to actually execute the foreclosures. Well, I'll tell you what, this is where good neighbors come in, because as Wisconsin was developing and a lot of these areas were significantly smaller, everybody knew everybody. And that local sheriff that would have had to come out and serve the foreclosure documents knew all these farmers. And the last thing that he wanted to do was see more pain and anguish in his community. So a lot of the local sheriff's offices really dragged their feet as far as serving the foreclosures and gave the farmers a chance to get back on their feet. But the railroads kind of had a stain, if you will, because a lot of these farmers were immigrants, and this caused them a great deal of problem here in their new homes. Now, on the genealogy side of things, especially here in Wisconsin, if you look back in court records, any of the local courthouses in any of the counties, and you dig back into those court records, you will be able to find those foreclosure cases and see what exactly happened. And it is a great tool to use to find out, exactly what land ancestors may have lived on, where was the family farm. And you also can combine that with railroad maps. We here at the museum have what are called the Interstate Commerce Commission valuation maps from the early 1900s. And that gives you a beautiful picture of exactly where the railroads ran here in Wisconsin, subsequent maps for other states in the Union as well. And it gives you the opportunity to pair court documents, railroad maps, and find out exactly where that land was and how it fit together in your ancestors' pictures. Now, let's take this a step further. How did the farmers and the railroads and railroad construction and land settlement kind of collide in the first place. As railroads were being built, most of the railroad companies were cash strapped. There were a very few that had wise financiers that were able to do things honestly and above board to garner the money needed to build the railroad. And you have to remember, the 1840s, 1850s, even 1860s, west of the Appalachians, as many of the railroads in our country were getting started, this was new technology. Folks did not know what they were going to encounter in railroad building. They did not know the big picture of what building a railroad was going to cost. Well, one of the mechanisms that came into play was a unique form of government support. As noted here in Wisconsin, local municipalities could not support a private entity. And this was the case in a number of different places as well. And you see here a poster for the Illinois Central Railroad Company that is now prepared to sell 1.5 million acres of choice farming land. Well, let me introduce you to the idea of a land grant. What the government did, the federal government at the time was not allowed to collect taxes, but to raise revenue, they were able to sell land. And so the lands that the federal government had, what they figured out to do was to actually make a land grant to the railroads. So as a railroad built, for every mile that was constructed, they received a certain amount of land. And the railroads were able to promote this and sell the land and recoup their construction costs. Now, for the railroads, and remember, we're talking 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, the last half century of the 1800s. The railroads not only had the land, but they began to make wild claims as to what they could offer. The poster you see here, the Illinois Central promoting that it's going to be able to have 2 daily express trains serving its line from Chicago down through Illinois, down to the southern states. So they created an environment that was advantageous for people to pick up land from the railroads. Many of the railroads even went to the extent of putting out some pretty slick brochures to promote what they had available. This one from the 1870s from the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad. And if you look at some of the claims that are being made here, we have 6% interest, which for the time was pretty good, a 20% deduction if you paid cash. They also offered a special ticket if you wish to come and explore the land. The ticket to go out and explore the land was actually at a dramatically reduced price, or in some cases even free. But if you read the fine print down in here, you will find out that if you wish to return after your inspection, there's actually going to be a fare to buy your ticket. And the brochure painted an incredible picture as far as what was available from the railroads and what they would sell it at. Now, let me take a step back here for just a moment. We need to explain land grant and what does this actually mean. We're going to go all the way back to the Land Ordinance of 1785. And we're talking about, at the time, what was the western part of our country. We're looking at territory west of the Appalachians. So think Ohio, think Illinois, Indiana, what today is Iowa, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. The land was surveyed and it was divided into townships. Each township was 6 miles in one direction and 6 miles in the other direction. So a total of 36 square miles made up a township. Each township, or each township was divided into sections. And those sections were numbered, as you see here, 1 through 36. Section number 15 was always reserved for a public school within that particular township. If you go on to, say, a service like Google Maps today and look at Wisconsin or any of the upper Midwestern states, you are still going to be able to see this grid pattern projected in farm fields, in township roads. The measurements that were taken back in the late 1700s still exist today. Now, what a land grant did was that the government said, okay, if here is your train line going through, that red dashed line through the middle of our screen, all right? First thing we're going to do is we're going to grant you a right-of-way. Some cases 100, 200, even 400 feet on either side of the tracks. The railroad, you get that as your right-of-way, all right? Any buildings you need to put, you may put in there. Any sidings, fine. Telegraph line goes into that space as well. That is your land to build the railroad. Then, as part of the land grant, what we're going to do, and again, depending on what the grant was, we're going to give you generally the even numbered sections so that we preserve that 15th section for a school. We're going to give you the even numbered sections. They're yours. Once you build through this mile, those sections are yours. And you may now sell those sections to recoup your construction costs. And this is where the railroads were able to go to immigrants and say, you know what, if you come to Wisconsin, to Iowa, to Illinois, to Indiana, Ohio, we've got great farmland and we'll sell it off for you cheap. And you come, you live on it, you farm it, you ship your extra product with us. This is a great deal. This is a fantastic deal. Here in Wisconsin, such a land grant was put into existence. If you remember when we talked just a moment ago, we had said that railroads really had developed down here in the southern portion of the state. And there was interest in getting lines up from basically Lake Winnebago to the Bay of Green Bay into the upper peninsula of Michigan, and then up into the northwest portion of Wisconsin. And in 1857, a land grant was given or was presented to Wisconsin to build a line to what is today Superior, Wisconsin and Duluth, Minnesota, and then a branch line over to Bayfield, way at the top of the state. Another line was to be built from around Oshkosh and Fond du Lac up through Appleton, through Green Bay, and then north into Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Now, the land grant was shrouded in controversy. The first controversy came from this. And any football fans out there that think that the rivalry between the Packers and the Bears, or just Wisconsin and Illinois to begin with, if you think that's a recent thing, say just within the history of the NFL, no, guess what? You're wrong. It goes all the way back to the railroads and the 1850s, all right? There was friction way back then between Wisconsin and Illinois. The two principal groups vying for the land grant was one, the Chicago Northwestern Railway, led by William Ogden, the first mayor of Chicago. And then, of course, the Milwaukee Road, the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and eventually Pacific, the Milwaukee Road as we know it, which was led by Byron Kilbourne's group based out of Milwaukee. And the logic was that this is a Wisconsin land grant and a Wisconsin group should get it. And there was a great deal of friction between the two camps, if you will. the Chicago Northwestern did eventually win out and get the land grant. And we see here in Wisconsin the selling off of a great deal of that farmland, and in the north, land for timber to immigrants. And if you look across Wisconsin, the patchwork of nationalities across the state is pretty incredible. And it goes back to this land grant of 1857 and folks being enticed into the state by cheap land and railroad service. Now, the railroads were pretty clever as far as how they actually pitched these land grants. And you're looking here at basically a real estate brochure from the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad. We looked at a map from them just a minute ago, from the 1870s. As these land grants came about, the railroads set up real estate departments. They were basically real estate agencies owned and operated by the railroads to sell off their land grants. And the railroads got pretty smart when you think about it sales-wise. They had brochures like this, and this one printed in German. They had them printed up in a number of different languages. This particular one was also translated into Dutch, Czech, and Finnish. And then the railroads took land agents and sent them over to Europe, into Asia, into areas where there was, say, political unrest or abuse of religious freedom, if you will. And these railroad land agents would take these brochures, put them into the hands of prospective people where they were living at the time with the message, we've got cheap land, we can get you transportation to get there, it's going to give you a better life, and man, I can make you a hell of a deal right here, right now, to move your family to America. It was a situation where these agents not only appeared in those countries, they traveled on the ocean liners that were traversing the Atlantic, in some cases the Pacific at the time, and it was almost a high pressure sales pitch to get folks to buy the land. And when you think about it, it is really a catch-22 in some cases. The railroads needed to make money to recoup construction costs. They had to have people there, and farming was the first business line, if you will, in order to have product for them to ship, which, you know, that catch-22, it kind of leads to, well, did we really need the railroads? What did the railroads really do? Would we have had immigration if we hadn't have the railroads trying to sell off their land grant? Kind of poses an interesting argument through all of this. Now, once a land agent had gotten somebody hooked, if you will, the next step was they would present you with a map of, hey, here's what's available within a specific area. And you'll notice here on this particular map that all of the little gray shaded areas are lands that the railroad has for sale, the lighter tinted ones. So this entire territory here, the railroad has for sale. These darker shaded ones, you'll notice some of them over in this area here. These are lands that have already been sold. And of course, here's that rail line going through in one direction, another rail line coming through north to south. But once you got hooked, then this was the map that was presented to you in order to actually look at what land you potentially wanted to buy. Now, there is one thing with these maps, actually a couple of interesting points. The front was the map. The back was a blatant, almost lying commercial for the land that was being sold. What you're looking at here, this is the back of that map that I just showed you. And it's describing the area that is shown on that map. And as you read this, the description makes this feel or makes it be that this is like the land of flowing milk and honey. There's no problem with farming this. Your crops you're gonna have bumper crops continually. This is the place to be. If we read up in the top here, there is no state in the Union whose farming imposes so few of the burdens of manual labor. Well, the land that these folks were trying to sell was between Missouri and Nebraska, and the map in particular here was around Columbus, Nebraska. And at the time that the railroads are trying to entice people there, this was uninhabited land. It had never been farmed before. And yet they're able to make these wild claims to immigrants that there's not going to be any problems. You're going to have, it's not too wet, it's not too dry, it's perfect. And yet when the immigrants are going to get there and see this, the story is completely different. And by the time the railroads have got immigrants onto the land, they've brought them in almost for free, but to get back to wherever they were is going to cost them probably more than what they've got in their life savings. And so they're kind of stuck. Now, here again, just another look at areas that were up for sale. And this particular one shows land grants relating to the Transcontinental Railroad in Kansas and Nebraska. The top section here, there is the line of the original Transcontinental Railroad. Probably one of the largest land grants given was for building that original Transcontinental Railroad. Interestingly enough, as the Transcontinental Railroad began, it was not just one line. There was actually a competition to see who would build from the east. So there was also a land grant and a railroad line that was being built up through Kansas into Nebraska to eventually meet with the main line of the Transcontinental Road. Of course, other railroads being built through Kansas, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe received a land grant you see down here. So literally millions and millions and millions of acres out in the western United States that are being put up for grabs by the railroads in order to recoup their construction costs and bring people here to the US. Now, what did the trip look like? What happened to our ancestors when they got to the US? Kind of what was the process? What role did the railroads play in getting them from the coast to this land that they were going to inhabit? One of the first stops was a place called Castle Garden in New York City, in the harbor of New York City. From April 3rd, 1855 to April 18th, 1890, the state of New York, this was a state-run facility, the state of New York greeted immigrants in this particular facility. This is where they processed them through. The facility was slipshod at best. Immigrants were abused. There was a lot of families that were separated. There really wasn't a lot of concern for health and other sanitary regulations or conditions. And so that led to, in 1892, the federal government taking over immigration processing in our country. And that is the point at which, yes, Ellis Island that you see here opened. And this became the federal processing station, the first stop for immigrants coming into the US. So as they were processed through Ellis Island, the next step was going to be to get them to the land that they were going to purchase or to relatives' homes somewhere out in the country. And from Ellis Island, almost 2/3 of immigrants went to Liberty Island. And this is a train and ferry station in New Jersey, right off the New York harbor. And from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, about 2/3 of all immigrants coming to the US passed through this particular facility. Let me show you New York Harbor. Of course, here, the Statue of Liberty. Here is Ellis Island. And from Ellis Island, then immigrants went here to the Liberty Island train station. Ferry slips here on the water. You can see part of the old train shed here. And from here, their train journey would begin out across the country. There were some from Ellis Island that were taken by ferry boat up to Manhattan, where they did board other trains at the train stations there. But again, most started here at Liberty Island. So what were these train journeys like? Well, during this time period, we hear about travel by Pullman car and Pullman Palace car and how wonderful passenger trains were. Forget all of that, folks, when it comes to the idea of immigrant travel. Immigrant trains were, in some cases, entire trains for immigrants. In some cases, they were a couple of cars tacked onto a passenger train, but there was very little record kept of the immigrant trains, the immigrant cars, or the immigrants themselves on the railroads. Few exceptions to this that we'll chat about here. But although the railroads wanted the immigrants, a lot of the train crews, a lot of the people actually on the trains disregarded the immigrants as people. They treated them fairly inhumanely. They were basically, for the operating crews, in many cases, one step above livestock being moved. The ticket price for an immigrant, for them, it was steep based on the money they had in their pocket, but it was significantly below what a first-class ticket would have been, and an immigrant never could have stepped up to that first-class ticket. I'm talking in the regular type of immigrant. You know, those that were well off, yes, you were buying first-class passage all the way, but for those coming to America to basically stake their claim in the land, you were on an immigrant train, and the conditions were less than ideal, if you would. And you know, back then, photography kind of just coming into being, there was still a lot of artists' renditions of what an immigrant train would have been like. And we're going to look both at an artist rendition and then kind of the reality of it. On the immigrant trains, you generally had entire families traveling together. You also had situations where unmarried men and unmarried women of different families were actually sleeping in the same car at the same time. Meals were generally cooked by the families in the cars. And if you can imagine the smell and the waste problems, it created a very unsavory situation. A bed to sleep in, what's that? If they were lucky, there was planks that were placed across the seats. There was no pillows provided. If they had a blanket, they would have brought it along themselves. Men slept with their dirty boots up on the seats, as you see right here. Spittoons lined the aisle, which the men used freely in front of the women. There was also plenty of smoking on the part of the men. Their restroom facilities was basically a hole in the floor of the car, potentially with a small partition around it. Okay, so the reality of it, a little bit neater than the artist version, but yet still families all crammed together. You'll notice wooden benches, no cushions. You also notice the racks up above here. In a lot of cases, everything that a family was bringing with them is in these baskets. In fact, my grandmother was lucky enough. She did not come over. Well, she came over on steamship. She came over already to meet family here. And there would have been a train trip out to Wild Rose, Wisconsin. And at the time, she was a young lady, and she had a small basket, just a little, I could put my hands around it. And she always told about clutching that basket the entire trip, on the steamship, on the train, all the way out to Wild Rose, Wisconsin. And in that little basket, she had everything that was precious to her in the world. Physical property, all in that one little basket. And if you can imagine in some of these other baskets, here is everything that a family is bringing with them. This is all they can afford to carry. It was all that they could possibly bring along or were allowed to bring. Now, records of these immigrant trains, few and far between. But what we can do is paint a picture of where the railways traveled, where the passenger trains traveled, and you can begin to connect the dots into some of the smaller cities around our country. There is a book called The Official Guide of the Railways and Steam Navigation Lines of the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Cuba. This one being a later edition from 1963. You also see they're starting to put airline schedules in. But the official guide details every recognized passenger train for every railroad in the country. No immigrant trains, but remember, since some of the cars were immigrant cars were tacked onto regular trains, it would be easy to follow and begin to lay some groundwork as to where a train might have gone. So example, for my grandmother, who settled around Wild Rose, Wisconsin, I know there was passenger service to Wild Rose. I'm going to find the official guide from back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. I'd have to pin down a kind of a date based on where. And then through this guide, I can look up the train service to Wild Rose, Wisconsin, or the town that you need to be looking at. And this will give you an idea of what the train schedule was, where the trains came from, what other towns along the way were involved, and you'll be able to begin to paint a picture of where the trains went that they might have traveled along with. Where do you find something like the official guide? There are some that are available digitally online. Here at the National Railroad Museum, we hold the official guides back to about the 1870s. So we would be, a railroad museum would be an excellent source to have us do some research for you. We do get calls on this probably about once or twice a week. So it is something that is very easy to look up and start to begin to paint that picture for you. The other thing I want to point out about most immigrant trips and something about railroading here in the United States, you will notice rail lines literally from all parts of the country are kind of focusing in on one city, and that is Chicago. Chicago has long been the rail capital of the United States. Even today, every major railroad except for one, and that is the Kansas City Southern, has lines into Chicago. And this particular map from the 1940s, you'll notice the plethora of railroads here. We have the New York Central, the Chicago and Eastern Illinois, the Illinois Central, the Rock Island, the Milwaukee Road, the Sioux Line, the Chicago Northwestern, all radiating there onto Chicago. There is a very, very, very good chance that if your immigrant relatives were coming from the East Coast, that they came through Chicago if they were going in anywhere in the Northwest or the Pacific Northwest or the Western United States. So doing some looking at railroad companies and railroad lines going in and out of Chicago will also help you fill in that picture of where they may have traveled and what the trains may have looked like. Most all of the railroads, and when I say this, and when you look at the map here, a lot of these railroads no longer exist through mergers or bankruptcies, but there are historical societies for them that have, in many cases, acquired the records, the corporate records, and they are an excellent place to research and find information about their immigrant trains, their policies on immigrants, so on and so forth. So a little digging with a map and a few initials and a couple of internet searches can lead you to a wealth of information. The railroads, as I mentioned, radiated out from Chicago. And you're looking here at the Milwaukee Road Olympian from the 1920s. One of the better trains coming out of Chicago, one of the flagship trains on the Milwaukee Road. Immigrants to research those down to earth, salt of the earth people. You're not going to find them on trains like this, but a timetable for the Olympian will give you a picture of the route that they traveled, and can also, as you see here in the picture, kind of help paint a picture of what might they have been experiencing as they were traveling along. Kind of wrapping up here, there's a couple other points I want to make, and a couple other groups that I want to take a quick look at. Remember we mentioned the Chicago's got the blues. Well, Pullman and his development of the sleeping car. And remember, George Pullman did not invent the sleeping car, he merely perfected it. Every one of his 10,000 sleeping cars had a Pullman porter. 98% of those Pullman porters were African Americans. Here in and of itself, we had a kind of secondary immigration, if you will. Those African Americans, most of them brought to the US as slaves around the time of the Civil War. The second and third generations came on as Pullman porters, and they began to move around the country. They were a social conduit. The blues, which evolved from a lot of the the field songs in the South. That's how Chicago got the blues. The Pullman porters brought it with them. They were able to move fashion and news around the country. And as they became wealthy by the standards of the time, they were able to move their families to Chicago, to Los Angeles, to San Francisco, and live a much better life. As a result, we had a lot of folks, a lot of immigrants who became railroad employees. And in 1935, the Railroad Retirement Board was established. This was basically Social Security for railroad workers. If you had an ancestor who worked for the railroad, you want to be in touch with the Railroad Retirement Board to look up their records. And it is going to give you where they worked, in some cases, rate of pay, when they retired, and a host of other information about their railroad career. And it is a great way to trace that family ancestry, not only physically across the country, but also career-wise. A Google search for the Railroad Retirement Board will take you to their website, and they will have actually a portal to show you how to search in a genealogical manner. A very, very powerful tool in tracing your family history. And the last subject I had mentioned at the beginning that, today the railroads still are involved in immigration. And as much as we have heard about border crossings in the southern United States and immigrants coming in from Mexico and Central America, the railroad still has a hand in this. And immigrants will travel the 1,400 miles from deep in Central America, some cases even South America, some cases walking for days upon days to get to a rail line so that they can basically hop onto a freight train coming north, as you see here. You'll notice the rail lines, and as I mentioned, there will be people who will, if they can, begin their train travels deep in Central America. Some will walk through the territories here to eventually get onto a train line in Mexico coming for the US border. The train is nicknamed La Beastie, and as far as a immigrant train is concerned, it is, I am told, and what I have read, one of the nastier experiences in immigration. There are gangs that will patrol the train, will collect a bounty for riding on their cars. People have been killed by being tossed off of these cars, so on and so forth. And it is nothing like what our ancestors may have experienced in the 1800s coming through Ellis Island, through Liberty Island, through Castle Garden. But yet it is kind of the modern version, if you will, of railroads and how they are involved in immigration. So kind of in a nutshell, folks, there is how the railroads have played a role in immigration here in our country. And as you can see, it really is an international story. It reaches across the globe. So questions, and I guess, Katie, I'll let you moderate. We'll see what we can do here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bob. What a wonderful presentation. I learned so much about how the journey, happened for many of our ancestors. We did have a couple questions come in.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is the ICC valuation maps available online anywhere?
There may be some instances where they are available online. The best source for those is going to be one of two places. And let's start Wisconsin. I know we have them here at the National Railroad Museum, and we would be more than happy to share that as a resource. That is for Wisconsin. Now, for the other states, if there is a railroad museum, check with them. If there is a government document repository, check with them. Otherwise, look to the State Railroad Commissioner's office. And I'm not 100% sure how that office is titled in every state, but every state generally has some government entity that takes care of the railroads. Check with them. Last resort would be go to the National Archives. The ICC valuation material is held at the College Park, Maryland repository. I say that as the last resort because there, if you're in your state railroad commissioner's office, your pond is maybe this big, okay? If you go to the National Archives, the pond just got huge as far as information to be looked at and competing research requests. So local museum, government document depository, State Railroad Commissioner, National Archives. That would be the places to look.
Very helpful. Our next question, how would one get from Quebec, Canada to Marathon County, Wisconsin? Ship and rail in 1857 or not? They're not sure if the railroad was built yet in 1857 in the Wausau area.
1857. Into Wausau in 1857, and I'll go off the top of my head here, would have been, I'm gonna imagine some kind of steamship around the Great Lakes, probably some railroad in Wisconsin, say to Green Bay. Well, no, not Green Bay yet. That would have been steamship into Green Bay. Maybe railroad as far as Fond du Lac or someplace in the southern U.S., southern Wisconsin, and then would have had been some other form of transportation across Wisconsin. Remember that land grant we talked about first was in 1857, so the actual construction didn't happen until a couple of years later.
And I did see Anne posted a link to the ICC information in the chat, so thank you so much, Anne.
There we go.
Our next question. I had ancestors in North Carolina that relocated to Florida to work as conductors on the railroad during railroad expansion. Is there information on how these men were recruited?
Oh, I think that how I would pursue that question research-wise would be what is the railroad, and then look for that particular railroad's historical society, and check on their personnel management records. Should give you kind of a good idea. The other place to look for something like that, and again, depending on the time period we're talking about, would possibly be go to your local library, see if they have records of the local newspapers, and see if there would be advertisements placed there for railroad personnel. A lot of times that was a very popular way to do it. The other thing that the railroads did many times, you got to remember, the passenger station, the local passenger station was in a lot of cases the center of town, and the railroad would post notices there as far as their personnel needs would be concerned. So again, a railroad museum, a local historical society may have some of those posters saved, that ephemera, those documents that would give you an idea of what language was used as far as recruiting was concerned.
Okay, our next question. How long did it take to travel from New York to California? And did the immigrants have to provide their own food on those immigrant trains?
Easy answer on that question was yes, they would have been on their own as far as meals were concerned. As far as time, let's do this. If we're looking by train, May 10th, 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, the trip across the U.S. by train at that point took about 10 to 14 days. If we get into the early part of the 1900s, that 10 to 14 days across the country would have been compressed immigrant-wise to, say, maybe 5 to 6 days.
All right. Can you tell us anything about trains which transported people who had died to the burial sites? So this person says her great-grandmother died in Chatville, Minnesota, and she was transported by train to Winona to be buried in Wilson, Minnesota.
Yes. Depending upon how the railroads handled caskets, there would have been a special rate for them to be transported, but also depending upon the railroad's policy and what trains they would have been traveling on, would have depended on the train where the coffin actually was carried. Many times it was placed in the baggage car, which usually traveled toward was toward the front of the train. Generally, they were placed on say sawhorses or some kind of a plinth, so that they would be easy to pick up when they got to their destination. That was something that was very common, because obviously over a long distance, it was the way we traveled. And yes, the railroads did, just like the airlines today, did move coffins to their final resting places. Yes. Let me add one thing onto that.
Sure.
The book that I had referenced, the Compendium of Railroad Schedules there, if you look in that book, there would have been probably information given regarding such movements, okay, or regarding how the railroads handle that, the official guide to the railways. That would have been there. There was information that would have been given there. The other place to look for that, if you kind of have an idea where the travel would have been, as we do in this case, we figure out what the railroads were, and if we can find a timetable from the railroad from that time, they would have stated their policies as well there as far as moving coffins was concerned. So.
All right. Our next question, did immigrants coming through Castle Garden also head to Liberty Island for train rides west?
It depends on the timing. Castle Garden came first. Liberty Island was opened after that. So there would have been some early immigrants that might not necessarily have gone through Liberty Island, but would have gone to other train facilities on the Jersey Shore or, as I mentioned, into Manhattan. So it's one of those there that you got to line up the timing and see how it fits in to the overall chronology of your trip and when the facilities were opened.
Were there any railroad lines directly from New York City to Milwaukee in the mid-1860s?
Mid-1860s, New York to Milwaukee. There would have been, well, no, there would not have been. There would not have been. And I'll give you as a reference is mid-1860s. If you remember another historic event, Lincoln's assassination and his funeral train that came from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, the number of railroads that coordinated to move that train was, I want to, without a book in front of me, I want to say it was like 12 or 14 railroads that coordinated that particular train move. So unlike, unlike say the 1920s, 1930s were coming from New York, you could have gone Pennsylvania Railroad into Chicago and then say Milwaukee Road from Chicago to Milwaukee. That network did not exist yet at that point. It was more smaller independent companies.
Yeah, so they might have had to go through a couple of different trains to get to their destination.
Yes, absolutely. There would have been your ticket would have been quite long at the time. Yes. So.
All right. Did rail travel for immigrants from the East Coast completely replace water travel through the Great Lakes by about 1880?
In some cases, yes. It also would have depended upon where they were going, and then also the economics, the ticket price, and who owned the steamship lines. There were some cases where the railroads owned the steamship lines, so they would have, would have used them somewhat interchangeably. By that time period, though, I guess if you're going to look at it, which way are things trending? Yeah, we're probably trending more toward the railroads, but I wouldn't rule it out completely because there was still some very strong lake traffic at the time.
Our next question. My great-grandfather was a track walker for the B&O Railroad between 1880 and 1910. Where can I find a day-in-the-life type history of a railroad worker during that time period? For the B&O, I will direct you to probably two very excellent sources. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. They have a very good archives. And of course, as their title says, they are all things Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The other place that I would look is the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Historical and Technical Society. They do have a very good archives. They have been doing excessive cataloging and entertaining research requests, and they would be able to give you not only
kind of the day in the life overall, but they should be able to distill that down to maybe even some of the specific routes that your relative was actually walking along.
Wow, that's wonderful. Are you aware of any repositories that have digitized railroad tickets that our ancestors might have purchased?
Digitized, boy. Off the top of my head, no, but let me give you the kind of the steps to start the ball rolling here. Do an internet search and put in some specific words. Let's just say Union Pacific Railroad, 1871, ticket, graphic image, digital print, something like that. And I think you'll be surprised at what you're gonna find or what's gonna crop up. Here's where you get to do a little detective work, though, because in that search, you kind of got to read between the lines and read some of the documents, and you're going to start to notice some common threads that will probably lead you to a better source. And let me make one quick aside here on internet searches in this kind of a research. All right, a lot of times, and we take kind of the first thing for granted on the internet. As we have progressed, as our information technology has progressed, there are a number of sources. Your local library, some of the bigger universities who have digitized primary source material and have it available online. And it's a great help in doing research. Still, I don't want to, knock the Wikipedia, because I'll be honest, Wikipedia has some great clues sometimes that lead you elsewhere. But if you dig a little deeper in some of these searches, you're going to be able to find some good primary source material, potentially like digitized tickets that we're talking about here. So spend a few extra minutes, do a little extra digging. It'll be well worth it for you.
All right, our next question. I have several relatives who worked for the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad in the 1800s and early 1900s. Is your museum the best source for that info, or is there a CNW museum?
Depending on what you're looking for, we may hold some information. The Chicago Northwestern Railroad Historical Society has their own archives and has most of the corporate records from the Chicago Northwestern. That would be a great source to look at there. Couple other institutions to take a look at. The Illinois Railway Museum does have some Chicago Northwestern material. Also, check in the Chicago library system. I don't remember off the top of my head. I always got to go look some of this stuff up, which library it is, but there is one of the libraries there that does have some Chicago Northwestern library material as well. Quick aside, my wife was a librarian for 27 years, and she always told me, you know what, you don't got to know all this stuff. You just got to know where to look it up.
Absolutely. I tell people that all the time.
which is why I'm going to send you to your local library all the time here.
And Susan did post in the chat referencing the other question about finding digitized tickets. She suggested the Digital Public Library, which is dp.la. It's a really great site of lots of digitized information from a bunch of different libraries around the world. So definitely check that out. And Michelle, I do think he might be talking about the Newberry Library in Chicago. That might be the right library. I know they have a lot of genealogy and historical information at that library. So
Newberry has the Pullman Company records. And that is, I mean, if you're looking for Pullman personnel, if you're looking for some of their spec books, things like that, Newberry is where you need to go. If you're searching Pullman, get ready for some serious digging and for some confusion. I have seen Pullman material that starts off and it will reference another document, and you get to that document and it references a third document, and you get to that third document and it leads you to a dead end. So it can be a real trip researching Pullman. So.
And Art suggested trying Railroad Historical Societies for digital images of tickets as well.
Absolutely.
And once again, that library website, dp.la, it's kind of a weird website, or you can just Google Digital Public Library and it should come up. So
absolutely.
All right, we still have plenty more questions, so
sure, go ahead. Go ahead.
Was there a significant historic train route coming from Canada for immigrants coming to the United States?
Let's see. Through Detroit, there were lines through Detroit that would have facilitated that. Coming from the west, Canadian Pacific, Soo Line, Canadian National would have played a role there, especially if you were looking at Asian Pacific immigrants. Also, if you're looking at Germans from Russia, those lines would have played a significant role. And I'll qualify that because some of those lines would have been delivering immigrants to the Canadian provinces. There were some that would have brought immigrants into especially the Dakotas. Especially the Germans from Russia would have used some of those lines to come into Dakota territories. When I say Asian Pacific, there's always been a very strong rail line running north-south along the coast, and at the border in Washington from Canada, yeah, there would have been immigration, south at that point as well. That would have been Southern Pacific on that north-south line on the coast there.
All right, our next question: where can I find railroad posters for recruiting?
Okay, just like personnel recruiting. Again, look at your local libraries, look at the local historical societies. Folks, don't bypass those local historical societies. They've got little scraps of paper saved that it's like, wow, you guys hung on to this. Thank you. Okay. Those would be great places. If you look at some of the bigger railroad museums, I know we have a few recruiting type things, but also if you get into some of the other big railroad museums, if you look at California State Railroad Museum, the Union Pacific Railroad has an excellent museum and archives in Council Bluffs, and they're going to have material specific to their railroad. The B&O in Baltimore would have the North Carolina Transportation Museum in Spencer. Excellent facility there. Other place, the National Park Service has Steamtown in Scranton, Pennsylvania. They have some archive material there, probably not as much as other places. But the other one I'd look at too is the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian Museum of American History, they have a strong transportation section. And I also would not forget the Library of Congress. Library of Congress has a very good poster collection. And, when you think of posters, we usually think of, color and glamour and glitz. They've got some material there that's going to surprise you as to what has been hung on to, paint the picture of what happened in our country.
Lots of great resources. Our next question: my immigrant landed at the Port of Chicago. Is there a particular place they would have caught a train to southern Minnesota?
That one you're going to have to figure out which railroad they traveled on. Chicago, remember, as we showed, Chicago was railroad central. Chicago at one point had 7 railroad stations. So going into southern Minnesota, Milwaukee Road, Sioux Line, Chicago Northwestern, those would be the ones that I would start. Probably also look at the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. So you're going to have to kind of do a little looking at those railroads, and that's where I would take and say contact us here at the museum and pose the question. Okay, they went to X town. We can look back in the official guide and tell you, okay, that town was served by these railroads, and that would nail that part of it down for you.
All right, our next question. They have an ancestor who sold candy and papers on the rails when they were a little kid after running away.
Yep.
Do you think that this person would find their information, or were they maybe paid under the table for doing something like that?
Usually, okay, those folks were called news butchers, and they were kind of the forerunner of the roadhouse, which led to the dining car. They were generally independent contractors. The railroads did not hire them per se, so employment records there probably going to be slim to none as far as I would know. That would be a real tough one to figure out.
Our next question: when and where did the orphan trains run?
Orphan trains were running kind of in the same period that we've been talking about here. There were a lot of orphan trains that did come from the east here to places in the Midwest and into the West eventually. Those orphan trains were in a lot of cases about on the same caliber as what the immigrant trains were. Some of the books that I have read, it was just sad, just plain sad. And there's going to be more records from the not so much from the railroad standpoint, but there's going to be records from the orphanages. All right, and that would almost be something that start looking, say, at the state level, maybe the county level, that local historical society level, and they all should have had some kind of record as to who came and when they arrived, and then you're going to kind of have to trace back from there, to see when and see what train lines they would have been on and whatnot. So.
Yeah, and Jenny did post in the chat that there is an orphan train museum in Kansas. So
yes, and I will apologize. There is again, under the guise of don't need to know it all, but know where to look it up. I know we here at the museum have got a number of very good documented books on the orphan trains. Have I read them yet? No, they're still on the to be read list. So. Sadly, that's kind of one of those areas of railroading that it's in many ways it's almost as tragic as what the immigrant trains were, more so because we're dealing with children. But yet at the same time, the whole series, the Boxcar Children, kind of glorifies that a little bit, almost a little bit too much. As opposed to kind of what the reality of it was.
Yeah, I loved those books as a kid, but as an adult looking back at them, I'm like, oh, wow.
Yeah, it kind of pulls the heartstrings.
Yeah.
So,
all right, we still have quite a few more questions.
Sure, go ahead.
How much would an immigrant have paid for a ticket, say, from New York to Wisconsin?
Immigrant fare, you're probably looking, and I'm just gonna kind of spitball this. You're probably looking at, say, 25 cents, maybe as much as $2.50, $3. You know, and man, we say that today, and it's like, that's, you know, that's pocket change. That's a, you know, it's a couple of sodas at the convenience store. But when you think about it, you know, most of these immigrants had their life savings was in their pockets. And, you know, they were probably holding, man, if they were holding, you know, if they were holding 50 or 75 bucks to buy the land that they were going to be on. And then you got to think about it. They got to shelter themselves. They've got to, you know, buy the equipment to do whatever, you know, business they're going to engage in. You know, that ticket price, man, that was a killer in a lot of cases. But it was down there. Good source. Take a look at like some of those posters that I showed you. Will kind of give you an idea of a little more definitive what some of the prices were as far as tickets were concerned.
Yeah, I'm sure it also kind of depends probably what time period too. So
yes, and let me a footnote on that idea just flash through here. There will come a period where the Interstate Commerce Commission begins to regulate those ticket fares. The Interstate Commerce Commission, there will be documentation there that will establish concretely what those fares were. Okay, you know, for example, I know from the 1920s, the top tariff New York to Chicago for a passenger was something like 5 to 7 cents a mile. All right. Well, multiply out by the miles and then extra fares for luxuries, and you got a, you know, top line ticket price. But they would have had that as well for the other classes of ticketing that we're talking about.
all right. So did immigrants who came through the port of Philadelphia get to Wisconsin in the 1890s by railroad, just like they would have if they came through the port of New York?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Because it was, I mean, it was the way that we traveled. It was how we moved. So yes, that would have been train as well.
Yeah, probably the easiest way to get there, especially that distance.
Well, I mean, you know, the alternative at the time, you know, 1890s would have been horse, wagon, and now you're looking at a trip that's going to be 3 to 6 weeks, where, you know, the railroad, it was the way to go, and
Yeah,
that's
a lot quicker.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, can you tell us anything about where to find more about the Texas Pacific Railroad?
Texas and Pacific was eventually, let's see, eventually became part of, I believe it became part of the Southern Pacific, which now is part of the Union Pacific. Check first for a Texas and Pacific Historical Society. There, I would also look at check the library in Fort Worth, Texas, because that's where TMP's headquarters were. In fact, the headquarters building is still standing. If you ever get to Fort Worth, quick aside, go see that building. Oh my God, if you like architecture, it is incredible. Check the county historical societies down there. That one would also be, take a look, contact the Union Pacific Historical Society. Now, when you're looking for something like that, I'm gonna introduce another source for you here. Most of the Union Pacific's, they have archival holdings at the museum in Council Bluffs, Iowa. The Union Pacific Historical Society has placed their archival holdings at the American Heritage Center at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, Wyoming. They have a phenomenal archive facility, and the width and breadth that they have in holdings is just incredible. That would be a place to look for any of those Union Pacific subsidiary or railroads that they had merged with as well. But that one, start with the Historical Society, and then look in Fort Worth, look at the library, look at the local historical society there.
And someone in the chat's wondering if TNP became a part of the Missouri Pacific, which became part of the UP. That's what they thought.
That is a possibility, and I'm going without my railroad family tree in front of me, but yeah, that is, I mean, they all did most of those, you know, Texas and Pacific, Missouri Pacific, Southern Pacific, all ended up under the Union Pacific family.
Still lots more questions, so if I haven't gotten to yours yet, hang on, we're getting through them, guys. Is there a good source to learn more about railroad disasters?
About railroad disasters, I'll tell you what, that there's to start you off on that one, go to your local library, have them, you know, if you're in Wisconsin here, have them get on WisCat, or you know, look at Library of Congress, or get on one of the national library catalogs. Start with, there are some very good books on disasters out there. The other place, if you want to get beyond the books, depending on when the disaster took place, you know, today, and we're talking within the last 20 years here, you're going to want to look at the Surface Transportation Board. They are the investigative arm for railroad disasters now. Prior to that, look at Interstate Commerce Commission records. Here's another thing too, when it comes to railroad disasters, usually there is some form of law or new regulation that comes out from some of the most serious ones. So looking at the Federal Railroad Administration, looking at their records would also yield you some pretty interesting material. But start at your library so you kind of get that picture of what disaster are you actually looking at, all right? You know, when you think about it, there, you know, during a given day, there is always some kind of a derailment. A lot of times it's just a wheel comes off the track and it's back on in, 15, 20, 30 minutes. It's not the spectacular things that make the news. So those big ones, those are the ones you gotta go do a little more digging for.
All right, our next question. My great-grandfather immigrated from Scotland with a shipment of Clydesdale horses. He landed in Montreal. Noted on a passenger list that he indicates he was assisted to Toronto. He entered the United States at Sault Ste. Marie in June 1888 and delivered the horses to a breeder in St. Cloud, Minnesota. So what railways might he have used, and is there any records to track his journey?
Okay, let's see. We are probably in Canada, and I'm going to go off the top of the head here. Probably Canadian National, into across the Upper Peninsula there, we're probably looking at either Chicago Northwestern or Soo Line, and that either one of those, and again, now St. Cloud. St. Cloud, without a map in front of me, St. Cloud, we're probably looking at, in fact, bear with me for 2 seconds. Let me see if I can get my railroad map back in front of me here, and see if we can pin that down a little more definitively. St. Cloud. You're probably, well,
just north of Minneapolis is where.
Yeah, just north of Minneapolis. Probably the Soo Line. Looking at the map, and of course the map, I'm looking at the map that I had showed in the presentation, which is kind of stylized, so it does not show everything, but probably the Soo Line would have been, just guessing here now, Soo Line probably would have been the one. The other consideration, if he came across from Sault Ste. Marie, it could have been Sioux Line into the Twin Cities, and then it might have been something like the Great Northern or the Northern Pacific into St. Cloud. And that would be that the easy way to find that one would be just with a more detailed railroad map. Okay, that, and those are, you know, if you go out and you look for, you know, say just do the date and say, you know, map Sioux Line Railroad, you're going to see there'll be plenty of maps that will come up that will have every city along the route, every station along the route, and then, you know, do the same thing. You know, just do a Google search or, excuse me, internet search for, you know, railroads in St. Cloud, Minnesota, and then trace back from there the railroads that show up.
Definitely helpful suggestions. There's lots of helpful suggestions in the chat as well. And a couple people did ask if we could save the chat, and I will save it and send it out with the recording on Monday. So don't worry about saving all the links or helpful information in there. I'll definitely send it out. So we have lots more questions. So let's move on. Where's a good place to find the foreclosure documents that you were talking about with land?
Those you're going to want to look at your local courthouse here in Wisconsin. So pick the county and take and search it out there. I know a lot of the Wisconsin Circuit Court records are digitized. I do not know how far back they go, if we're getting back into that 1850s, 1860s period. But there again, that would be local courthouse for your particular county here in Wisconsin.
Did the railroad continue selling land to immigrants into the 1890s?
Yes, yes. Something to understand. As the railroads built through, and then especially as we got, you know, past Wisconsin, we got into, you know, west of the Mississippi. All of the railroads to the west, with one or just a few minor exceptions, had a land grant. And we think about, you know, the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s as being this big period of railroad expansion. That was really the start of the big period of expansion. So yes, into the 1880s, 1890s, yes, there was still land being sold off. The one railroad that did not take a land grant was the Great Northern. James J. Hill was a shrewd enough financier that he declined to need any outside financing like that. So yeah, all of those railroads to the west, definitely land grants, and they were selling off into the latter decades of the 1800s.
Are there any records of tickets purchased from that Liberty Island train station?
There, I'm going to send you to the New Jersey Central, any kind of historical or technical society they have, because it was the Central Railroad of New Jersey that operated that particular station. And here again, you know, immigrant tickets, you know, there may have been some discussion or policies you might find on it or whatnot. You know, the ticket purchasing in some of these time periods like we're talking about is not like it was today. You know, today on Amtrak, they need to know who you are. They need to know what seat you're assigned to or what compartment. You know, back then, no, that was not. The records were not that strict. And then again, especially when we come to immigrants, you know, even looser. So for that one, look at the Central of New Jersey and see if their historical society has anything there. Also, Liberty Island is, if I remember correctly, it is a New Jersey state park facility. You know, check with there as well.
So how would someone have traveled from Monroe County, New York to Grant County, Wisconsin?
Well, you're looking definitely train and into Chicago to begin with, and then Grant County I am thinking is either Milwaukee Road or Chicago Northwestern. So they would have gotten themselves to Chicago and then onto one of the other respective railroads from there.
All right, our next question. I have an ancestor who was killed in a coupling accident. Where would I find information on that?
Look at the railroad itself, and if we're talking this time period from the they say the 1870s to the 1890s, a lot of those particular injuries were kept in some beautiful ledgers, and we're talking ledgers big. We'd call them a coffee table book today. They were big. And a lot of that information was recorded in these by hand, beautiful penmanship. I know we have a few here at the museum, and it's going to depend on, it's going to depend on the railroad and kind of a tracing of where did the railroad's records go to. If you're looking at one of the big railroads, like say Chicago Northwestern, good chance that their historical society might have something. If you're looking at, say, in Wisconsin, and this is something I kind of didn't get into because it's germane to immigration, but it adds a very confusing layer. When we talk about railroads, we're naming off some of the big ones. You've heard me reference, here in Wisconsin, Sioux Line, Chicago Northwestern, Milwaukee Road. Realize that before those railroads became the systems that we recognize, they were a conglomeration of very small railroads. And each one of those railroads had their records, generally kept by a clerk in the corporate office, which could have been a room over their largest station. And a lot of that material, if at the time that they got bought up by somebody else, somebody had the thought to, save it away, great. If not, some of it is going to be lost to history as well. So that one's going to be you're going to have to trace back to almost the date of the accident, or at least the year of the accident, and then figure out what railroad was actually involved. And then, the historical society, the local library, the local historical society probably would be the places to search for those things.
All right. So for those who entered the United States via Castle Garden and headed to the Midwest between the 1850s and 1880s, would they have likely also taken trains?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Because again, there's not much other means. There's not many other means other than, horse, wagon, stagecoach, to make the trip. That's going to be the most efficient way to travel for the time.
Our next question is about the Railroad Retirement Board website. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it or not, Bob, but they're asking, where on the site would you search to find records of someone?
And I have not been on their site for a while, but when you go onto the site, and let me do this while we're talking here, and we might come back to this. Let me just call it up and see if I can give you a little better portal to look at, because I know there is one place on there where they do specifically talk about finding railroad records on the site. So why don't we go on, Katie? Why don't we go on to another question? Let me, as soon as my computer decides that it wants to join the conversation here, let me come back to you on that one, okay?
Someone's asking on, we might have already covered this, I think, but where to look for railroad accidents. If there's an archives or railroad, where would they begin that search?
Yeah, again, Surface Transportation Board. Look up Interstate Commerce Commission, also investigated. Federal Railroad Administration would be a good good source as well. And again, try to have some information on the incident to begin with. Other place to take a look there is, look for some local newspaper accounts to give you some better details about that. So, all right.
All right. The next question, their ancestor came to Ellis Island in 1893, and then the next record they found of them is when they landed at the port of Chicago. So they're wondering if they got to Chicago by waterway, would there be a particular place they would have caught a train to get to southern Minnesota?
If we're trying to track down from Chicago to southern Minnesota the specific train line, look at the city that they went to in southern Minnesota, figure out what train lines went into that city, and from there you can trace back to Chicago, and you should be able to even figure out what station in Chicago they potentially departed from.
All right. Can you discuss railroad ephemera and its availability, either digitally or on purchase sites like eBay? This person says, I've been able to purchase a reasonably priced vintage ticket for a line one of my ancestors used. Not actually their ticket, but still kind of a cool thing to have.
Sure. Railroad ephemera, most museums are going to have, most railroad museums are going to have a pretty good collection. I know we have quite an archive with ephemera. There are train shows around the country that are starting to ramp back up as the pandemic kind of winds down here, and there will be dealers that will be there that will have ephemera for sale. I guess my one thing, buying there or buying on eBay is, be the judge of the price. You need to put your value on what you're willing to pay for those sorts of things. Again, as I've mentioned earlier, there's a lot of places that will have a lot of this has been digitized, and you can see some very good primary source material that's out there. Some of the bigger universities, especially their media collections, their digital media collections hold a lot of hold good examples of ephemera. Again, go to the Library of Congress. Their website is phenomenal with the digital holdings that they will present for you. And listen, don't discount your local historical society or your local library, because as time goes on, and staffing permits, the local things that are being digitized, pretty incredible. So, any one of those sources, and again, excuse me, this is one where when you start with one search, you're going to need to do a little digging and a little mining, because search A you're going to find some clues. That's going to take you to B, to take you to C, and so on and so forth. And you might be 4, 5, 6 steps down the line before you have that aha moment and go, hey, this is what I was looking for. It's out there. You just gotta kind of dig for it. So.
All right. I'm still working through questions, so thank you everyone for your patience.
Sure.
We've had actually over 50 questions, so
Oh, wow.
Thank you so much, Bob, for your time and continuing to answer all of these.
Not a problem.
The next question, there's a family story of a 14-year-old German immigrant walking from New York City to a town south of Chicago. But my theory is he rode a train to Chicago and walked to that smaller town. Have you ever heard of a kid walking that far from New York City to south of Chicago?
I want to interject a joke in here and go, man, if he's after a slice of deep dish pizza, I'd probably walk that far. But it's not, again, depending what time period here, let's qualify walking. All right. Did did he actually, boots on the ground, walk every step of the way? Or, was this hey, I caught a ride in a farmer's wagon from here to here, and did I maybe hop on a train as a hobo, per se, for part of that journey as well? Most comfortable journey in the world? Probably not. Is it possible? I mean, could somebody have physically walked it? Yeah, I mean, sure, they could have with the fortitude to do it. But, I guess if you're looking at kind of historical supposition, I would probably bet that there was some train transportation in there, and it was in the form of hoboing, hopping onto a freight train to eat up a few miles in there. All
Yeah.
right. So,
That's quite a journey if they did walk the whole way.
yes. So,
Someone's wondering, are there records for telegraph employees with the railroad?
if they were a railroad employee, yes, there would have been, because they were regular railroad employees. Okay. The thing to look at there is going to be the position title. Okay, a lot of times somebody is not going to be labeled strictly as a telegrapher. They might be a station agent. They might be a clerk. So you've got to kind of look at what were the job requirements leading to them learning how to operate a telegraph. Okay, and again, if they were a railroad employee, yeah, there would be records. You also there probably want to look at something like Western Union, because a lot of times Western Union did have a telegraph outlet in the local railroad station. Okay, and there again, we're going to have two different employees: the one that worked for the railroad, the one who worked for Western Union. All right, so. Katie, let me just step back for a second here. I've got the homepage for the Railroad Retirement Board up here in front of me, and there is, just looking at what they are presenting here. They've got a section under their menu called Resources that does go through a good deal of information about railroad employment, railroad retirement. They also have a FAQ section, which, dialing into that, does have a number of very broad topics to start with, including one here about updating your records, which would at least get you into the record section. And as you look down through that, there are a number of very specific questions as far as, how can I do this? Where can I find that? So, just, there isn't they have kind of redone their website from the last time that I was on it. So go in, do a little poking around. They also have, with every question, they also have some great what are labeled as additional resources that take you either to other federal documents or other resource pages within the Railroad Retirement Board. All right, so that's going to be one where you're going to have to nose around the site just a little bit to find out, to find the right pocket in which the information is going to be for your specific question. Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right. Moving on then. Following up on the coffins that are being transported on trains, would coffins need to be accompanied by at least one person on the same train, or would they be handled like a piece of freight with no need to accompany them?
I'm not sure off the top of my head what the official railroad policy was. I have heard of it being done both ways, where someone accompanies and then, yes, it is just a piece of freight. So there's stepping into fiction for just a moment, but obviously based on reality, Willa Cather has a great short story called The Sculptor's Funeral that talks about a coffin being delivered to its hometown from one of its local residents who have passed. Obviously, she was writing from an experience, fictionalized story, but there again, you'd have to look at the specific railroad policies to find out the requirements.
Sure. All right, our next question. My great-grandfather was a conductor on the Rock Island line out of Des Moines from about 1900 until he retired in the late 1940s. Around 1917 to 1919, he disappeared from home for several months, then came back home as though it was just another day at work. Can you think of any reason a railroad worker would have been sidetracked for a time? I mean, off the top of my head, I'm thinking the war, of course.
Yeah, war. There was a, depending upon your seniority, being reassigned was not uncommon. And understand, in the railroad world, everything is based on seniority. And if you have, if you've got the seniority, you can hold a job in a particular area, particular division, particular terminal. If you don't have the seniority, you're last in is first out. You may need to stay employed, move to a different division on the railroad and bid on a job there. So yeah, there is the possibility that this individual may have been bumped because of seniority rules. The other thing that happened is you did have some railroad employees, conductors, brakemen of that nature, that were labeled as boomers, and they basically shot around. They had a little wanderlust, and so they'd work somewhere for a while. Maybe not see eye to eye with a superintendent, maybe just want to try working somewhere else, and they would move on. And maybe a different railroad, maybe same railroad, but come home again, not, depends on the circumstance. So there's a couple of ideas as to why that could have happened. The war is another one. But the war, though, generally the war, both of the wars, the railroads were pretty conscious about their personnel, and usually for the wars, depending upon what the position was, most of those railroad positions were protected, especially during World War II, because the railroad was vital to wartime transportation. It was vital during World War I as well, but the behavior of the railroads was not as good as it was in World War I as it was in World War II. So disappearing off from military service, probably not. I'm guessing more so a seniority situation.
All right. I think we probably answered something similar to this question already, but how might have immigrants gotten from Castle Garden to Madison in 1859?
Again, into Chicago, and then from Chicago to Madison, that's either Chicago Northwestern or Milwaukee Road. Would have served Madison.
All right. Someone's wondering if you have any information about the Southern Atlantic Railroad. They're not sure if that's the right name, but it was a railroad that was out of Greensboro, North Carolina.
Off top of my head, no, I don't have anything. I'm not familiar with that. But I'll tell you what, that one I would refer you to the North Carolina Transportation Museum, and give them a call or see what their internet portal is. Get to their curator and pose that question, and they probably will be very, very helpful for you.
All right, our next question. They have ancestors who returned to the East from California to fight in the Civil War, and they wonder, how they got from California to the East. Did they travel by rail, or what other suggestions could they explore to try to figure out how they might have traveled?
If they're going from California back to the east in the time of the Civil War, if they're going overland, we're looking at horse, stagecoach, wagon train. They're depending upon their financial ability. It could have been by boat to the Isthmus of Panama, walked across the isthmus, and then boat the rest of the way either to New York or to someplace on the Gulf Coast. Remember, the West was not connected until May 10th, 1869, 4 years after the Civil War ended. So we're, in that time period coming east, you're in the wagon train, stagecoach time period.
We got 10 more questions, guys. We're getting to the end.
All right.
Has there ever been any money paid to the Native American tribes for the land that was taken by trains?
Oh, again, I'm gonna off the top of my head, that's one I'm gonna have to go look up. First reference for me that comes to mind is digitally. I know that the treaties of Fort Laramie are out there somewhere. Look for those treaties to start with. That was a series that were of treaties between the U.S. and the native tribes. That's going to give you some detail there. The other place to look, take a look at some of the books on the Transcontinental Railroad. Empire Express by David Hayward Bain comes into mind. Also, Murray Klein did a 2-volume set on the Union Pacific. Look at volume 1. That's going to give you some information there. Look at some of the older writings on the Transcontinental Railroad. D. Brown, Hear That Whistle Blow. I know they kind of wander off the chronological narrative he does, and addresses some of the Native American issues. All right. Yeah, that's and all those books I cited, local library. Go
Absolutely.
get them there. Yep.
And
Okay.
Jenny did say in the chat, maybe checking the Bureau of Indian Affairs as well might be a good starting point.
Yes.
All right, what would be the route from Troy, New York to Paoli? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's in Dane County, Wisconsin.
Again, we're gonna head into Chicago, and then into Dane County. I'm gonna again probably guess into Madison, or I'd actually have to look at a map and see if Paoli was on one of the lines, but you're looking again, Chicago Northwestern or Milwaukee Road would be the ones we'd be talking about there.
Someone's wondering, was riding the rails in hobos, is that fact or fiction?
Oh, very, very much fact with a lot of fiction thrown into it. There were, I mean, hoboing's a whole nother program that we could do. But there is, the nutshell is this: hobos are basically migrant workers, and hobos existed before the railroads came into being in the U.S. There were people walking around trying to find jobs, city to city, plantation to plantation, farm to farm, before the railroads got here. When the railroads came into being, hopping on a freight train and saving some shoe leather was a convenience. Now, the hobos did, believe it or not, organize, and there was a social hierarchy in their own language and their own. The hobos, if you were a true hobo, there was actually a code of ethics that you were going to try to follow. So yeah, there's a lot of fact involved in that, and there's some pretty good adventuresome fiction as well.
So how would a person have traveled from Northeast Ohio in the Cleveland area to the Colorado Denver area around 1900?
Okay. Cleveland again, you're gonna be, well, let's see, Cleveland would have been probably New York Central Railroad into Chicago. From there, the kind of the straight line is going to be the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy into Denver. If they were going, well, no, yeah, Chicago, Burlington, Quincy, probably the best bet. Union Pacific also had trains that went from Chicago to Denver. But New York Central, my best bet will be New York Central to Chicago, and then Union Pacific or Union Pacific, or excuse me, Chicago, Burlington, Quincy, or possibly Rock Island into Denver.
How do you think my relative traveled from Nova Scotia to southwestern Wisconsin in the late 1850s?
Late 1850s. Wow, that's going to be that one. There's probably going to be a little bit of train in the east. I'm going to guess there's probably going to be a lot of Great Lakes water transportation. And then if they came into port, say in Milwaukee, we're probably looking horse and wagon the rest of the way, because the first rail line in Wisconsin was only Milwaukee out to Waukesha. So yeah, you're probably looking Great Lakes transportation, and then depending on the exact date, a little railroad, but more so probably horse and wagon.
All right, this next one is 1908 from Baltimore to Kansas City.
Baltimore, 1908 from Baltimore coming west to Kansas City. Probably we're going to hop on to Baltimore and Ohio. Again, without that official guide in front of me, the Baltimore and Ohio did have trains that went into say St. Louis, and then from there, one of the other railroads going across to Kansas City. That's one possibility. Could have been Baltimore and Ohio into Chicago, and then Santa Fe into Kansas City. So there's a couple of different routings that you could take.
All right, our next one is 1870 from Philadelphia to Atchison, Kansas, with a family of 6. Do you think they took the train or a wagon trail, or maybe some sort of combination with the Erie Canal?
1870. Let me look up one date here.
We're really picking your brain here today, Bob.
Well, these are, and I'll tell you what, I'm gonna tactfully stall here while I try to get this one date that I need. These are the types of questions that, believe it or not, we get all the time.
I bet.
And it is either genealogical research, just like this, or it's a scenario where, say, we have somebody trying to recreate a historic trip, or even fiction authors will write us and say, okay, we're doing historical fiction, and we want to get I've got someone I need to get from New York to, in this case, Atchison, Kansas. Okay, so Philly to Atchison, Kansas. Good chance it probably is going to be the Pennsylvania Railroad to start with. Pennsy did have trains going into Chicago. Also, I do believe they had a connection in St. Louis. I'd have to look at a map for sure. But then into Atchison, Kansas, we are most likely, like 99.9% sure, going to be on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. All right.
Even with all those kids, like, did they charge for kids on railroads? That's my own question. I'm
There
curious
been
now.
yeah, there would have been a child's fair. Yes, there would have been a child's fair, definitely. Yep. So.
What would the job of a railroad engineer entail in the 1870s?
1870s. Well, you're the one that is running the locomotive. You're responsible for following rules as far as speed, as far as stops are concerned. You are also responsible for proper handling, and by that I mean, the railroads early on were kind of persnickety about abuse of equipment as far as resources were concerned. If you were running too fast, you were using too much fuel, and therefore somebody was gonna get called on the carpet for that. The 1870s, it was a good job. It would have been some very long hours. It was not, you didn't have, by the 1870s, you didn't have, say, the union protection that the engineers had later on through the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers. You're in a steam locomotive, so you're working in a hot environment. And you're the guy out there where the steel wheel meets the rail. So you're kind of one or two rungs up on the corporate ladder, if you will. So there's a lot of things that roll downhill to you that, you gotta do them. 1870s safety, was nowhere near what it is today. And, so there was some pretty horrific accidents in which engineers perished. The technology also, was not as advanced. So there was a lot more concern with, say, boiler explosions, or with, keeping a locomotive lubricated so they would not overheat. It was a tough job, but it was a job that was looked up to, if you will, because you were kind of on the cusp of this new technology that was permeating the U.S.
Definitely. All right, our next one: travel from Ellis Island to Iowa.
Okay, from Ellis Island, you'll start off on the Jersey Central, and again, it actually depend on where in Iowa. We'll make it into, make it into Chicago, which be that's what'll happen there. From there, could be Rock Island, could be Santa Fe to the southeastern portion of Iowa, could be Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, could be Milwaukee Road. Number of different options depending on where in Iowa actually ending up.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're narrowing down a couple more.
All right.
My family member purchased 120 acres of land in Mineral Point, Wisconsin in 1858. Was this likely a railroad land grant, or were there other land grants at that same time?
No, probably would not have been or 1858 Mineral Point. No, would not have been a railroad land grant, because the two land grants for Wisconsin here basically went Oshkosh, Fond du Lac, Oshkosh, northeast here to Green Bay, and then went basically Wausau, Stevens Point to the northwest. 1858, the railroads in that part of the state, that was some of the earliest railroads established. In fact, I've got the map in my mind. I'm thinking that's probably predecessor of the Milwaukee Road, and probably their line that ran out toward Prairie du Chien. Get a map and check me on that one, okay? All right.
All right, our next one. In the late 1890s, our Swedish family sailed into Montreal and took a train. Just before or after crossing the border, someone died, and at the next train stop, she was buried. So how would this person find out where?
Okay. That one, identify the railroad that they were on, the date, and search for the official map of that railroad for that particular time. The official guide would also be able to tell you, and that will enumerate the stations. And so you should be able to very easily enumerate the stations along the way. And that's gonna narrow it down. If it was actually the next station, okay, easy enough. I think the question I'm going to ask is it the next station they stopped at, or was it a scheduled stop, or did they make an intermediate stop to accommodate removing the body from the train? Okay. Either way, an official map is going to give you those stations, and you should be able to narrow it down to a few options, a few choices.
Yeah. All right, our final question. An ancestor ended up in Brownsburg, Texas in 1944 from Auburn, Indiana. Would it have likely been that he went to Texas by train, and which line would he likely have used?
1944. Good chance it was by train. 1944, and I'm not, this one I'm not, without a map in front of me, this one I'm not going to hazard a guess on the rail lines. That one I just don't have a picture of in my head here. And I'm gonna get back to my little map that I used in our presentation, which I know is lacking in some ways. 1944. That's an interesting. It's an interesting question for a couple of reasons. 1944, travel by hitchhiking / hoboing is a definite possibility. Rail is probably going to be the primary guess as to how. But you got to remember something. 1944, we're in World War II. And there is travel for unnecessary reasons is highly discouraged. If you had business, or if you had business dealing with the war, yeah, travel definitely encouraged. But otherwise, just to take a trip, railroads discourage that incredibly. So that that kind of brings in another factor. Where were they ending up in Texas again?
Oh, let me pull it back up here. Brownsburg, Texas.
Brownsburg. Yeah, any number of railroads. I mean, we could have been Southern Pacific, Missouri Pacific, Texas and Pacific, depending upon, how they came into town. So a lot of options there. That would be one. That'd be one to contact your local railroad museum and have them pull out the official guide for you. Okay.
Yeah.
So. All right.
Well, once again, Bob, wow, thank you so much. That's the longest Q&A session we've ever had, and you are just so knowledgeable. You were just rattling off answers one after another. So I'm so impressed, and so many wonderful comments in the chat about how wonderful you've been, and how helpful this session has been, and how excited people are to research more. So thank you again so much for your time, and for everyone who stuck around until the end. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure being with you, folks. Best of luck with tracing your genealogy or further railroad explorations. All right. Been fun talking with you today.
We hope to see everyone December 11th for our next presentation. Like I said, it's going to be on researching institutionalized ancestors. So hopefully you're able to join us, and everybody enjoy the rest of your afternoon of researching more on your railroading ancestors. Take care, everyone.